have a normal sex with this one.
We give an example. I love it. I love it. I think David and Carmen are in Texas.
Yeah, and Tom and Mary, and Southern Earl. Yeah. So I won't take it personally that the number of folks has diminished.
A lot of people have done that.
Yeah, well,
Time of year.
let me ask a housekeeping question here. How many people think they'll likely be here next week? Likely be here next week. Okay, how about the week after, which would be the 16th? 16th. You won't be here. I mean, I don't know what the sort of critical mass is. That if we dip below that critical mass, we want to say, all right, let's just leave it. And, so I'm not sure then that we'll meet the 16th because we're just 10 now. And I feel like I want to dip under that.
Yeah.
You'll be in the States.
You need 1.5 or 2 books.
What's that?
For the small group one,
Okay, yeah, I think actually that's well said.
It's your time too, so.
Well, I'm gonna be preparing one way or another. I mean, if I use the stuff another week, that's fine. I mean, there's 16 chapters and we'll cover all 16 chapters. So eventually. Yeah, eventually. So maybe, and we'll discuss this again next week and see how many people are here. Maybe we won't meet the 16th. Maybe we'll take our break after the that'll be what the 9th, I guess. That will be our last until January. I think probably, yeah, for having groups, we probably about 10, and that's what we are today. We're 10 with Daniel. Okay.
When we start up again in January, sorry, I missed that.
We'll start.
When we start in January.
Yeah, we'll start the first Monday, which will be the 5th. I'm sorry, the 6th. Yeah, I mean, which is Smiles. I don't think there's a parade or they're gonna close the street or anything like that. No. I mean,
There's some of the deals area, they don't understand toys for the kids. You can't, like, you won't walk it, no.
Okay, so I it's kind of a long break, but I think it's maybe better for our conversation. All right, well, let's begin with our prayer. We may have 1 or 2 stragglers who will come in. Let's yeah, there's 1 page and then there's discussion questions here. Okay.
Page out of each pile.
Leave that pile there for the moment. Okay. The Lord be with you.
Also,
Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Patty said something really interesting, or really interesting before we started. You want to share that, what you said at the very beginning about conviction?
microphone.
I don't remember. I said that this, now I remember. I said that Romans tends to be a very, did I say convicting?
Yeah.
Convicting. book, but Father Frank is presenting it in a way that doesn't, because it teaches us. Yes.
You keep on. Well, you finished, sorry.
I was finished.
Okay.
Say all of the beginning.
And this is one of the things,
It's one of those things that just sort of comes out of my mouth and
no, but it struck me that lots of people have a very negative impression of St. Paul. You know, that he's finger wagging and preachy and, you know, makes a lot of people feel miserable by the way he talks about what we imagine he's saying we should be doing. And I am trying to open this up and really getting into this part of the book, chapter 8, is especially, I think it especially works to broaden our perspective about what Paul is about and what being a Christian is about. This chapter 8 is, if I had to give it a title, I would title it The Spirit-Enabled Life. And Paul is continuing the argument that he began in chapters 5 through 7. And he's explaining that although we human beings, we believers, we Christians are still in the body and thus subject to our human limitations of body and mind, God's Spirit still lives in those of us who set our minds on the things of the Spirit, those of us who are faithful to Christ. And the conflict between the spiritual and the human limitations will continue because we, Christ's followers, are still human beings. We're still living in bodies. We still have human minds. But here's the point of chapter 8. Victory is assured for all of creation. We're going to do something a little bit different in our discussion groups today. What I would like maybe this side of the table to discuss question number 1, and this side of the table to discuss question number 2. And maybe somebody in your group will volunteer to be a scribe. Okay. Okay. Let me read both questions. Okay. Question number 1. What do you remember about the Bible story of creation? Work as a team to retell the story in your own words, writing a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs. Try to include details, especially about what happened after God created the world. That episode commonly called the fall. Okay? And then the second group, discuss what do you remember about the Bible story of the Exodus? Work as a team to retell the story in your own words. Try to include details, especially about how the Israelites came to be enslaved and how they were liberated from slavery. Write a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs. Include details about what happened after they were liberated. And Patty, I guess you have the advantage. You can choose which team you want to be on. We'll have one team of 4 and one team of 5. And yeah. Daniel, maybe you can join group 1 here, okay? Then we'll have 2 even teams if you want to do that. Very good. So I'm going to give you 8 or 10 minutes, okay? This we're going to look a little bit later at how this fits into what Paul is getting at in this chapter. We're not using artificial. We're using our normal.
Yeah, too much for my dog to this one night. By our standards. I know. Well, we're talking about the story in it, so it's not about the.
Okay.
Story just started. Okay, so the.
Not just, and God, this is what I'm seeing improve.
Still brings further salty.
Okay, couple more minutes. Get to work.
So other disobedience is something banned from their absolutely perfect place.
Yeah.
Where everything was perfect. They were constant with creation.
Trying to get back to
They had to leave and then God put some really scary angels outside.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, even was guarded. So they couldn't, the time to sleep, that is.
Yes. Oh my gosh, you got so said to so these midwives sit around and cool. We were you know consequences of the school. We see things this thing which just but this girl and to accept it.
So those stuff, what did the term say? There's a power.
At that point, there were requirements, it was all creation, there was only one rule. One admonition, which they wrote.
Actually sold those, the caravan.
So the serpent said that they would have.
Had before. God help us less often, so it.
They're not sort of
There's a lot of scholarly,
person, okay, you guys.
I wouldn't say debate, but that it was in writing of some sort. Exactly what you're saying, that actually, what is it, you're in the same place?
Yeah, she's.
And possibly flyers and flying around.
We get to say that two seconds.
Yes.
There was only
And
one.
was sweet and she wanted to.
And
He was 17.
a consequence of their disobedience. You had authorization.
Yeah.
In the garden. Okay, that's that one sentence short of the paragraph.
Well, we haven't talked about.
Well, creation, okay, creation, okay. Creation was by our standards.
What, no, okay, we can call it that, but I just wanted to specify what, within our.
How long ago do you think that was?
I think we're coming up on 6,000 years according to what is,
1,000 years.
yeah, what's, in Judaic tradition.
But the geologists, archaeologists.
Well, there's a whole thing that I have to find about that. In that scientists are trying to describe eternity in linear, find it to linear time. And because it is eternal, and it always was, it would appear in linear time, it'd be billions of years up. But God's time, it's not it's more than time about the geologists. It's like.
Okay. We can put aside, put this aside, pause. We're gonna go forward and let me first say, this exercise is something like how the Bible came to be known by God's people in the time before literacy was widespread. The stories of creation, of the Exodus, were told and retold, usually, often in families. Okay, mother and father would tell these stories to their children. Details and ideas were remembered from generation to generation. And eventually, those stories were written down in detail. But this is something like the process. Now, I want you to hold your thoughts about creation and about Exodus, because we're going to come back to them in the context of this letter. Obviously, St. Paul's letter was not written in this way. But certainly the Old Testament stories and particularly the first 5 books of the Bible, this is kind of how it came to be and how it came to be known. I mean, probably most of us, maybe all of us, have a Bible or a couple of Bibles in the house. If you were living in the time before Jesus, you don't have a scroll in your house. You know, maybe there was a scroll in your synagogue.
Not until Moses.
Yeah, but right.
Which is a long, long time.
Yeah, it's a long, long time. It's a long, long time. So, just an interesting aside. We're going to use the stories, but not at this very moment. I want to bring you back to Romans chapter 8, verse 11, okay? And I'm just going to read Romans chapter 8, verse 11. If the spirit of the one who raised Jesus from the dead lives within you, the one who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies too, through his spirit who lives within you. So Paul is elaborating on what it means to live in this renewed realm of the Spirit. Unfortunately, our allegiance to this new realm doesn't mean that we're exempt from the influence of the old realm of the flesh. Okay? That is the constant struggle. Paul emphasizes 2 things here. He emphasizes that believers belong to this new realm. And he encourages them to beware of the encroachment of the old realm. Okay. Veronica, will you read for us, please, verses 12 through 17 from Romans chapter 8?
So then, brothers and sisters, we are obligated not to the flesh to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. But you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you received a spirit of adoption. When we cry, Abba, Father, it is that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs. Heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. If we in fact suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about translation, because there's a nuance of translation, possibly even a mistranslation, some scholars would say. This line about we are under obligation, or we are obligated not to the flesh. In the Greek of the New Testament, that's financial language.
Obligated is financial.
That word is financial language. And in some translations, it comes across as we are in debt.
Oh.
Okay. So we've got the Spirit of God in us, the same Spirit that raised Jesus. And the gift of the Spirit is the culmination of the plan of salvation. I want you to think about that for a second, because we don't often emphasize this idea that this is the ultimate achievement of salvation, that we have the Spirit living within us. Think about that. It's not just about forgiveness. It's not just about new life. It's about having God's Spirit within us. I think that makes this a very dramatic passage. And interestingly, we might think that Paul would tell us, okay, since we've got the Spirit within us, we should be living our lives out of gratitude for God who planned this wonderful thing and accomplished this wonderful thing. But instead of that, Paul sort of takes a right turn and he starts talking about something else. He says, we're under obligation, or more accurately, we're in debt. We're in debt, and we're not in debt to the flesh.
Right, in the Hebrew to English, it says we are not debtors.
Okay.
So it's right.
Yeah, there's a nuance here. Thank you. Let me ask this question. Why do people get into debt?
They overspend.
They overspend, okay. Well, aren't there any positive aspects to debt?
Sure, you can buy a house,
Buy a house,
car.
buy a car, okay. But as you say, Claire, debt is not always positive. People can get in over their head. Sometimes the car is too expensive. Sometimes the house is too large or too elaborate, right? Or then we have people who have like gambling debts, right? Debt in that sense can become a burden. The point is we need to say no to certain kinds of debt. And that might be painful or difficult. Saying no to debt is a kind of self-denial. Otherwise, that debt drags us down. So that's where Paul is going with this. We're not debtors to the flesh. Don't live that way. He goes further with this explanation into Old Testament territory. Follow me as I read verses 14 and 15. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you received a spirit of adoption. Paul is going into Old Testament territory here. He's echoing the story of the children of Israel traveling through the wilderness to the promised land. Tell us your version of the Exodus story, group 2.
Want me to tell it?
Yeah.
Joseph was the son of Jacob, and he had a lovely coat. He was his father's very favorite son, and he had the gift of prophecy, which he saw through dreams. He came across his bragging, and his brothers were very unhappy with his bragging. They threw him. Well, they were going to kill him. But one of his brothers said, no, let's just sell him to this caravan going by. They sold him to the caravan. The caravan took him to Egypt. He had lots and lots of misfortunes. Again, because Joseph, and he let his mouth run. Eventually, he became Pharaoh's number 2 man. And he was in charge of the plans for saving Egypt from famine. When the famine came, his brothers were sent to Egypt to get help. And Joseph not only gave them food and money and gave them a big scare, but he also invited the family to join him in Egypt. And the Jews then became part of Egypt. And they had lots of babies. And after a while, Egypt was afraid, and they said, we've got more Jews here than we have Egyptians, and they need to be our slaves. Is that fair enough? Okay?
And what happened to those slaves?
They cried out to God and said, what the heck happened here?
Yeah.
We were guests of the Pharaoh and now we're not. We are slaves. Because the new Pharaoh had no ties to the old Pharaoh and no ties to Joseph and no obligations to do. He said, I'm going to clean the swamp. And so he did. And said, you guys get to be slaves now. God heard them. God provided Moses. Are we going into Moses now?
Now we're going into
Okay.
Moses. Anybody want to follow up or you want to?
There was a long time between,
Oh, yeah.
There was a long
between
time.
Absolutely.
that took
Yeah, well, it took
generations.
time for a family of 12 sons and all of their family
To turn into over.
to turn into, yeah.
They were so successful that Pharaoh Joseph, his generation passed, and Pharaoh came along with generations later, and they started enslaving them. They even ordered the midwives to kill the baby boys in order to keep the pharaohs, and treated them so cruelly. Of course, along came Moses, who was born into the Levi by the Pharaoh, and he was born to a Levi that was found by Pharaoh's daughter. They don't go through his child like in the movie. They typically killed the Egyptian buried in the sand. He took out and he flees. When that was stretched by God to come back, and we go through. How many plagues were there? 12.
Well, that kind of mirrors
Yeah.
in Joseph's story, because 2 Israelites were brought into Pharaoh's household and changed the course of history.
Yep. So we've got slaves crying out for freedom and God makes a way. The story of the parting of the Red Sea. And then what happens? They get to the other side and God puts the waters back together and the Pharaoh's troops are not able to pursue. But what happens after they are freed?
They're disgruntled.
Yes, they fuss and they whine and they can't
A lot of
believe that God brought
I
them
don't think it's better.
out to die.
And what do you remember about the people of Israel being led? What do you remember about that?
They were led by smoke, right?
Yeah.
Smoke in the daytime and fire in the nighttime.
Yeah. And if all of these echoes are here in this part of Paul's letter to the Romans. The Israels were led by God, just as we are led by the Spirit, led by the pillar of cloud by day or pillar of smoke by day and the pillar of fire by night. At various times, they wanted to give up and go back to Egypt where they had been in slavery. This is what Paul is talking about. They wanted to go back to the old realm. It's it's human nature. But they clung on despite their rebellion and their idolatry. Exodus chapter 4, verse 22 says, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Let my people go so they can serve me. The point of it all was that they would arrive at last in the land that was to be given them as an inheritance. All of these ideas are echoed here in this 8th chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans. The wilderness, the desert, the wandering, the lure of the flesh. Instead of the pillar of cloud and fire, Christians are led by God's Spirit. Led by the Spirit as the personal presence of the living God. And the temptation is always to go back to the place of slavery. That is Paul's point. And he makes it by telling a story that would have been familiar, by referencing a story that would have been familiar to his listeners. His point is, sometimes it's easier to be enslaved. But then there wouldn't be this inheritance to look forward to. Paul is reminding his listeners, his readers, sometimes the way is difficult. And then there's this matter of God's Spirit coming together with our spirit. Sometimes our thoughts come from our own mind and our ordinary flow of consciousness. But then there are other times when our thoughts seem to come from somewhere else. Thoughts about God's love, about holiness, about a call to do a particular task. A key part of Christian discipleship is to recognize that voice and to nurture it. That voice may or may not be God's voice. So what's the key? What's the key to understanding where those thoughts and promptings come from? What's that?
Discernment.
Discernment. And how do we discern whether those promptings come from God's Spirit or from somewhere else?
Life-giving.
Life-giving, yeah.
It would be consistent with Jesus.
Consistent with Jesus, yes. And if you look closely at this passage, there's another aspect to this, in addition to being consistent with the teachings of Jesus. It is that spirit of adoption calling Abba, Father. One of the primary things that God's Spirit says to us is, you are my child. And if that prompting to do something or to say something or to be something is motivated by this inward knowledge that I am God's child, then you can be pretty sure that that's coming from God's Spirit. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. All right, let's turn to our next question. This is a kind of a funny question. Everybody gets the same one this time, and we won't take quite as long. What are the advantages and disadvantages of being a slave? What are the advantages and disadvantages of being an adopted child? What obligations does each role imply? What thoughts and feelings does being a child of God bring up for you? Take a couple of minutes, just maybe 3 minutes, and talk about this. Hey, what did you come up with?
Yeah, it's fine to find.
Okay.
What did you come up with? Are there any advantages to being a slave? No responsibility.
You get to eat. You get to eat.
You get to eat. Somebody takes care of you. Yeah.
A place to sleep.
Place to sleep.
And you have an assigned value.
You have very well said, Connor. You have an assigned value. Obviously, there are disadvantages, which would be punishment,
Lack of freedom.
No freedom.
lack of freedom. Okay. What are the advantages of being a child? An adopted child, yes.
Someone chose you.
Someone chose you. Beautifully said. Somebody chose you. Any disadvantages?
You might want to be searching for your origin, to want to know who your real parents were.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, absolutely. Other disadvantages, perhaps, to being an adopted child?
She just said. Well, the Europeans are now your class.
Uh-huh. That was not such a big thing in the ancient world, but I'll get to that. That's a very modern thing. Being,
But also, sometimes slaves were subjects in Rome.
that's one of the places that I'm gonna go with this, Claire, absolutely. Are there different obligations, of a slave and a child?
Yes.
What would they be?
A slave has to do whatever nasty thing there is given to them. A child wouldn't have to do those things because the slave would be doing them for him.
Okay, yeah, interesting, yeah. And what does being a child of God bring up for you? What does that imply for you? Did you get that far to talk about that?
How about they were chosen?
Yeah, we were chosen, yeah. Okay, Patty?
Being loved.
Being loved, yeah.
But adopted also means you're not of the nature of the person who adopts you.
Interesting.
You're not gods. You are adopted.
Well said. I have never thought of it. That's quite accurate, quite good, yeah. They,
We don't always use the word adoption, you say you are.
yeah, here he very specifically uses the word adoption in verse 15. And the children of Israel were promised an inheritance, namely the land of Canaan. But later they were promised the uttermost parts of the world. And this passage harkens back where he's talking about inheritance and those kinds of things. He's harkening back to the promise to Abraham and Sarah, but they would inherit the world. That's what he wants to bring up for us in this passage. So then in verse 17, let me read this because this is important. If we're children, then heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if in fact we suffer with him, so that we may also be glorified with him. Great. This is one of the other advantages of being an adopted child. You get to be an heir. You inherit your adoptive parents' rights and privileges and treasures, as long as we suffer with him so that we may be glorified with him. Now, what is this glorification all about? I mean, does that mean we're like going to shine like human light bulbs? What does it mean to be glorified? Paul's thought is that we will share in Christ's glorious rule over creation.
Oh.
Okay. Which brings us in a strange way back to the theme of debt. We are debtors to God, who loved us and saved us and is leading us home to the land that we've been promised. And that land is not Canaan, it's the land of the new creation. God's gift to us is not for us alone, but for the purpose of working through us to bring about the transformation of the world. I want you to think about this. What we do in the name of Christ, gathering resources for this reverse Advent so that people can be fed, teaching people skills so that their lives can be enriched or their lives can be bettered. These are ways of focusing our attention on the transformation that God is already doing. It's a way of cooperating with God in creating a new world. Does that make sense to you? It's more than just doing good for somebody. It's cooperating with the work of God in transforming the world. That's our call. Now, the interesting thing is, Paul tells us all of this without using imperatives or commands or shoulds. No conviction here, no finger wagging. There are two contrasting conditions in 13th verse. If you live according to the flesh, you'll die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you'll live. Both living according to the flesh and living according to the Spirit are real possibilities. And Paul doesn't say to us, well, then you should choose the Spirit. And if you don't, you're in big trouble. If you don't, you're going to the place where the air conditioning is permanently broken. Okay, he doesn't say that. He simply points to the two alternatives and says, you got a choice to make. Okay, let's, Connor, would you read for us verses 14 through 17 again?
14 through 17.
Yeah.
For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. But you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you received the spirit of adoption. When we cry, Abba, Father, it is that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if we in fact suffer with him, so that we may be glorified with him.
Okay, thank you. We've talked about one possible interpretation of slavery. Here's another. Paul is drawing this contrast between being a son of God or a child of God with being a slave. And I think earlier, Claire, you said in the Greco-Roman world, emperors and heroes. No, let me get to that later. In the Greco-Roman world, emperors and heroes were called sons of God. Paul uses the term to tell us something about our status. He uses it to contrast being a slave. An adopted son is a privileged status, okay? It changes status. If you were a slave, you could be adopted. And it changed not only your status, but it changed your future. It gave you an inheritance. So it was a movement from an unprivileged or underprivileged status to a privileged status. The adopted child was afforded intimacy, social standing, and freedom. That's what we get as God's children. Intimacy with God, social standing, maybe another way of talking about forgiveness and freedom from sin. It's a change in our status, and we're given freedom. God's children are able to call Abba, Father. Slaves can't use that language. Slaves say, Master.
Yeah.
Children say, Abba, Father. Think about this. There are only two people in the entire world. How many billions of people in this world? Only two of them call me Dad. I mean, some people happen to call me Father or Padre, but that's different. That's not the same. That does not imply that special intimacy. that special relationship. You know, some of the rest of you have this great privilege of being called dad. Think this over. Only a very small handful of people in this world use that title for you. And we use that title for God. One other point about this before we go on and I take your question. This Abba, Father, is not a childish daddy thing. It really is a term used by both children and adults. My daughters are adults, they're 36 years old. They call me the same thing that they always call me, Dad. Okay? Question or comment?
Kind of place to what you just said. Hebrew is very specific and very subtle. And Paul is an educated Hebrew speaking Jew. The actual word for father in Hebrew is Ab, A-B. Abba is more like daddy. It implies an intimacy and a depth.
Right.
That
Yes.
makes it less formal.
Yeah, but the point that I'm trying to make here is it's used in very specific kinds of relationships.
Exactly.
Very specific kinds of relationships. It's like I say, only two people in the world call me dad.
And I mean, Paul was specifically specific in the words and the language he chose.
Yes, oh, for sure. For sure. I mean, that's why I wanted to go through all of this about the Exodus and being led in the Exodus by the pillar of smoke and the pillar of fire, and now we're led by the Spirit. We were slaves to sin. They were slaves in Egypt. All of those echoes are there. He is using very specific language. Let's go on. Claire, would you read for us Romans chapter 18, chapter 8, verses 18 through 25.
I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longings for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its enslavement to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning together as it suffers together the pains of labor. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what one already sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience.
This is the big picture, people. This is the whole plan of salvation. This is God's intention for creation. Paul is beginning here with this promise that the present suffering, although intense, will be far outweighed by the glory that's going to be revealed. He says, for us. You were saying that Paul is a very specific writer. He doesn't say the glory that will be revealed in us, as if glorification were something we could achieve on our own and be proud of. And he doesn't say glorification that will be revealed to us as if we're spectators. The point of glory, as Paul uses the term, is that it means Christ's saving rule over all of the whole world. That's what the creation, that's what the whole world is waiting for Christ's rule. That's what the whole creation is waiting for. It's waiting for us and for all of God's children to be revealed. And at that moment, at last, creation will see its true ruler, and creation will know that the time has come for it to be rescued from corruption. Let's finally hear the story of creation from group number one. Tell us what happened in creation and what happened to creation.
Okay. God created heaven and earth, cosmos. By our standards, it was chaotic.
Before the creation, it was chaotic.
Well, must have created the chaos too.
Okay, very good, okay.
God created order by our standards, by separation and limits. Adam and Eve in the garden had nothing that they needed to be set right, but there was one limit, or one restriction or admonition, and they violated that because they wanted to be like God. So they, as a consequence of that, they were banished from perfection, and they suffered limitations and hardship and deflection.
Okay, good job, good job.
And that became more rather than inward.
When we look at creation as it is in the present, we see a world in the same condition as the children of Israel were in when they were enslaved in Egypt. Imperfect, not the way things were intended to be. Just as God allowed the Israelites to go down into Egypt so that in bringing them out, God could define them as the freedom from slavery people, God has allowed creation to be subject to futility. Think this over. In our current world, we have the present round of summer and winter, growth, death, decay, birth and death. In a very real sense, our world, our creation, nature is enslaved to decay. Think about the larger picture: earthquakes, hurricanes, volcanoes. Nature, creation is full of energy. But lots of times that energy doesn't achieve anything. What about this promise of the wolf and the lamb lying down together? You know what happens nowadays in this world when a wolf lies down with a lamb? Yeah, right. Somebody gets lunch. Okay. That's not what God intended. But Paul promises that one day it's all going to be different. This new creation will be achieved. It's not the way it should be right now. But God promised to Abraham, way back, remember talking about Abraham? What chapter was that? Chapter 4? Remember talking that God promised Abraham one day the whole world would be put to rights. But because of what we learned back in Romans 1, the human race was put in charge of creation, and human race rebelled and worshiped parts of creation instead of worshiping God. So creation fell into disrepair. God allowed this to happen, but promised that one day the whole world would be put to rights according to the original plan. The plan is that, here's the plan. Here's the plan. Human beings would take their place under God and over the world, worshiping the Creator and exercising stewardship over creation. Creation is waiting on tiptoe for the particular freedom it will enjoy when God gives to God's children that glory, that wise rule and stewardship, which was always intended for those of us who bear God's image. Isn't that so much better than a sort of disembodied going to heaven?
Yeah.
That's the goal. A whole new world. It's a strange idea. I think most people who are not Christians wouldn't get this, that God has subjected creation to futility and slavery, but that creation is being rescued, is being freed, is being restored.
My son's father-in-law is an atheist and a philosophy PhD. So he says, I couldn't believe in a God who allows children to suffer. And Paul says here, which I think is the key point, I consider the sufferings of this present time not worth comparing with the glory to be revealed to us.
Suffering is not the end of the story. It's not where things stop. Because God somehow is rescuing that, is using that, is making something of that. I mean, we believe that, we have hope that that will happen. But if that's what you look at as the end point, yeah, you would be stuck there. If I believed that was the end point, I'd probably be an atheist myself.
Yeah.
But that's only part of the picture. It's a resting place. It's not the end.
It creates in us empathy and compassion.
Yeah.
But in chapter 17, something that is called, if we in fact suffer with him,
Yeah.
but, if that's a big if.
Yeah.
God is suffering with him, means.
Yeah. What does it suggest to you? Suffering with him, as opposed to just suffering.
I think if I believe that, God suffers with the suffering of the world, then compassion and empathy and, for people.
It gives our own difficulties and hardships meaning, doesn't it? It's not meaningless that God is present in our sufferings, that God suffers with us, that God's heart breaks when our heart breaks. We're not alone in this. I mean, we just had all this stuff about being children, right? Don't we suffer if our children suffer? My daughter was in the emergency room over the weekend. I mean, I was like ready to buy a plane ticket and go up there. They got her the right medication. She's much better now. But I mean, that's an example. We all have stories like that if we have children or anybody that we love. We suffer with them, and God suffers with us.
So yesterday in Richard Grohl, I don't know if anybody reads Richard Grohl, but yesterday was about Romans 8:22. And if you read it, and it was equated Paul's comment here to Darwinistic evolution. And if you take into suffering and pain, all this, everything we've gone through since creation, since actually said that, and you read this right here, it says, for the creation was subject to futility, not of its own will, but with the will of the one who subjected it, and hope that the creation itself will be set free from its enslavement to decay, and will attain the freedom of glory that shall be God, which tells me what is the progress.
Yes.
Yes. All it's God's will. We're all going there, but we're achieving them.
I've got a lot of material to go through here, and I do want to finish the chapter. So rather than breaking into groups to discuss what comes to mind when you think of nature, do you think that creation is subject to futility, that creation is not at present the way it should be? What evidence do you see to back up that claim? What evidence do you see to support the contrary, i.e. that nature or creation presently exists as God always intended it to be? Quickly, any thoughts about that? How do you see nature? As the way it should be, or maybe not the way it should be?
It should be. If God has granted us freedom to screw up, And the screw ups are in fact are a sign of our faith.
Yeah,
So it is God intended us to practice with this nature.
Well, it gives us the opportunity to make another choice
Yeah.
the next time.
Yeah.
Considering the circumstances.
and, you know, I think about, and this is just one little example, I think about water shortages in San Miguel. Where did that come from? It comes from agriculture. Well, we need that water to grow food. But somehow there doesn't seem to be enough water, or we're not caring for it properly in a way that enables everybody to have sufficient water or sufficient food. That to me is a sign of the futility of creation. We're stuck in this cycle. And maybe we're making some progress at being better stewards of water and air and resources.
We're destroying the planet with pollution.
Yeah, and that one of the reasons why we're destroying it is because we need certain resources to function. And somehow we haven't figured out a way to use those resources.
We have global warming, and we're not doing what we need to stop the global warming.
And you're absolutely right. And I think that's precisely part of the point that Paul is making. We could have a long discussion about this, but I think you're following where Paul is going with this, the futility of creation. We don't think about it, you know, we're stuck. Well, Paul moves on to consider the present position of God's children in light of the future. He says we're longing for the time when we ourselves will be fully and finally redeemed. At that time, we will receive resurrection bodies. We groan and sigh, experiencing the tension between the glorious promise and the present reality. The Spirit is already at work in us, but has not completed the task of full renewal. We have the first fruits, that is to say, the beginnings of the Spirit's life, and hope, like faith, has an element of certainty, groaning and waiting, eager but patient. And then Paul uses this strange imagery of birth pangs. The creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. We know that the whole creation in verse 22 has been groaning together as it suffers together the pains of labor. But not only the creation, but we ourselves, while we wait for adoption. I talked about this, how the church is called to share that pain and that hope. The church is not to be apart from the pain of the world. It is to be in prayer precisely at the place where the world is in pain. That's our calling. Okay. How do you respond to these ideas of new creation and the church playing a role in the birthing of the new creation? What role do you see for yourself?
Yeah. It's so overwhelming. There's so much brokenness. Where do you even start with picking up a stone or turning off the faucet?
Okay, so it's overwhelming. That's one response. Other responses?
Jesus became one of us, became part of this mess. And so we have that consolation and help. And Jesus became part of this. Creation groans, but he's part of creation now.
Yes.
I see the church as a community of, if we're all reading, or at least we have to hear about it. I think one of the problems about fighting climate change, or whatever it is that we all have to move together. You know, I can do my little bit about water if somebody others aren't doing. Because I remember when there was a tipping point about recycling. You know, nobody was doing it, and then they said you gotta do it, and everybody fell in enthusiastically and got their bins and discussed it. So that's what I think. You know, my little one thing is speaking of futility. But if we're all in it together, and this is what happens when they meet at these summits, they can't all agree with it.
Yeah, a good point. We could, I mean, I really want to finish this chapter today. I don't know if we're going to even going to be able to do this, but this is something to think about, this idea of new creation and the role that you play in giving birth to this new world. And how that's related to our actions, however small they might be. Okay.
Ask how many people this table recycle.
Well, here in Mexico.
I hate to think that, Veronica, but you may be right. Okay.
If there are things that they do, they separate plastic, they separate.
That's probably be interesting to follow on those recycling,
Yes.
and see exactly what happens.
Yes. Exactly. Okay, let us, Patty, will you read for us verses 26 through 30?
Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, but we do not know how to pray as we ought. But that very Spirit intercedes with groanings too deep for words. And God, who searches hearts, knows what's in the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for all the saints according to the will of God. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn within the large family. And those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified.
Okay, thank you. I really like this about God, the searcher of hearts. That image here that I have is of someone turning on a flashlight or lighting a torch and going slowly around a large, dark room full of all kinds of things, looking for something in particular. Ever had that experience? You know, there's a power outage and you're looking for something and you don't quite remember where you put it, and you've got to be looking through the whole living room or dining room or kitchen for that one thing. That's the image that I have here. What is God, the searcher of hearts, hoping to find? And what happens when God finds it? Well, what God wants to find, okay, is not the can opener, okay, or your wallet or your telephone. What God wants to find are the sounds of the Spirit's groaning.
In my notes, I have likeness of the Son,
In the last verses that we read, we heard that the world is groaning in pain. And then we saw that the church shares in this pain and suffering and in the tension between the already of the first fruits of the Spirit and the not yet of our mortal existence. So the church is not apart from the world, and God isn't either. God comes to dwell in the middle of the world's pain. it's strange that at the very moment that we're struggling to pray and have no idea even what to pray for, at that moment, the Spirit is most at work. Ever had that experience where, I should be praying, I want to pray, but I don't even know what to say. I don't know what words to put to this. I don't know. That is when the Spirit is most active in you.
Oh, well,
We tend to think it's the least active. It's the opposite. When the groaning is beyond
you
words, when
encourage me.
prayer is beyond prayer, when prayer is beyond human sight or human knowing. God understands what the Spirit is saying, even if we do not. God hears those painful groanings. This is a very different kind of prayer than we are used to. This is what happens when we worship the true God while the world is still out of joint. There are plenty of things that we can pray for with some articulateness, but there are lots of other things that we pray about when we're in God's presence and just allow the Spirit to grow. Maybe that's your prayer assignment for this week. When you face a situation and you don't know what to ask for, what to say, just let the Spirit grow.
I like
Maybe that's what you say. Maybe those are the words. Just groan. Just groan for the Spirit. Okay. The searcher of hearts is searching for that groaning and recognize it for what it is, the suffering as Christ suffers. I don't think we're going to finish this in 10 minutes, but I've got one more little portion, and then we'll do the very end of the chapter next week and start on chapter 9. But verse 28, 29, and 30. Sandra?
We know that all things, she read that.
Yeah.
We read that. Yeah, where did you finish?
I finished at 30.
30?
Read it again.
Okay. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose.
Now, let's just stop there. How do you respond to that? Do you find that comforting, or do you find it difficult to believe? Again, I'm taking the discussion questions, and we're going to do it as a whole group so I can get through this.
But who possesses the good? Those who believe, or for good in general? Work together for good. What?
I'm not sure I understand.
So, we read it, all things work together for good. All work together for those who love God, so that good would come out.
I think that
God loves us, we're Christian. Good will come of everything. For us.
eventually,
Eventually. But why just for us?
I don't think it is just for us.
That's why I agree. That's what I said.
I think in this, for us, in the sense that the ultimate goal is that creation will be restored.
Whole thing, yeah.
In that sense.
Yeah, okay.
But so that's one response. Other responses, I mean, do you believe this? Do you find this comforting, or do you think what?
I totally believe this, but there are times when, not for my own life, but when I look at things like the war with Gaza, and I think, what good is coming of this? And I believe there will be a good, but at what price? At what end? I can't even begin to imagine.
What a good point.
Yeah.
What a good point. Yeah. How do we look at that and say somehow, God is at work in this? Yeah.
Well, we know this is how the story ends. I mean, God lives, period. Doesn't mean we don't have a whole lot of icky stuff to go through to get there, but
Like in our lives.
It's in our time.
Yeah.
Does it mean that if you love God, you will not worry?
but we will see it whether we see it from this perspective or this
But it's
perspective.
I think-
of God.
I think that you're asking, if we love God, we won't worry? Is that the question?
Yeah.
I don't see how we can avoid that anxiety. I mean, Patty loves God. She knows how the story ends, and she's troubled by this horrific thing taking place in our world. That's really where Paul's emphasis has been through these last chapters. That tension between the new realm and the old realm, the realm of the spirit and the realm of the flesh. I mean, how could we be caught between two places like that and not feel anxiety, worry, confusion, and yet at the same time, along with that anxiety and confusion and worry, we have hope. We know how the story ends. We know God is in charge. That's really hard, but that's what it is to be a person of faith.
I'm struck by the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. Because you're looking around, you're seeing innocent people dying. You're seeing injustice all over the place. And God says, you will do that. He can't do more. He can't do more.
Yeah, and imagine that God is talking about those of us who are mourning, and those of us who are poor in spirit, and those of us who are hungering and thirsting after righteousness, even though that's a terribly uncomfortable, distressing place to be.
But who mourn, they shall be comforted.
Yeah,
Eventually.
Yes, but it's all eventually, it's.
yeah. But I remember I talked about this last week, how it's so hard to talk about future when we talk about God, because there's the distant future and there's the near future. And when we have those moments of consolation and peace, that is kind of a foretaste or a promise of what's coming in the distant future.
And then there's the now.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. Verses 29 and 30, this will be the last thing I say, and we'll go into that. I had a feeling, and I was trying to avoid this. I had a feeling we were not going to run out of time. Oh, well. This is not a course where we'll complete it in this many weeks, and if we don't, there's not a syllabus here. The syllabus is we're going to do the letter of Paul to the Romans, all of the 16 chapters. And this really is the most dense. But I wanted to just say about verses 29 and verse 30. Please don't focus on this unhelpful language about foreknowledge and predestination. I mean, we could really go off the rails on that. I don't want to do that, okay? I would prefer that we focus where Paul focuses, which is on God's plan and God's purpose, which is that we as God's people will be shaped into the pattern or the model of Jesus. We will be shaped into the true image of God, that we will be, as Jesus is, genuinely human.
So, I asked you something?
Yep,
What if we're all predestined?
that's why I don't want to talk about this.
I was thinking, okay,
Yeah, I mean, the Anglican Church has, basically since the Reformation, not spent a whole lot of brain matter on talking about predestination. We've left that to the Calvinists and, have a good time, people. I mean, I think it's a dead end. I don't think it's helpful. I mean, I just don't think it's helpful. I don't think it's helpful. I don't think it helps us to have a grip on what to do, how to pray, how to live. If you're worried about, am I predestined to be saved or to be damned?
Is my name in the book?
How is that helpful on a daily basis? I think it's entirely unhelpful. And that's why I don't want to go there.
Predestination says we have no freedom.
That's why I don't want to go there, Gus. I don't want to talk. No, I don't think it's helpful. What I hope is helpful from what we've done today is this image of the new world order. That the work that God has started, God will finish. And we are part of that. We are promised a role in that. And what we do today matters because of that. That's so much more important and so much of a better place to be. So I'm going to stop here with a feeling of frustration that I've rushed through stuff and that I haven't been clear and whatever. But we're going to go back and do the end of this chapter and the beginning of chapter 9. And really, things take a left turn in chapter 9. So thank you for your attention. This is, it's terrific to be part of this with you. I hope we're discovering some stuff together that we're gonna hold on to and, so.
One other small thing that you